They sent her to the wrong groom, but his child hugged her and cried, "Don't go, you're my mommy now." The dusty stagecoach jerked to a violent halt, sending 20-year-old Evangeline Pierce tumbling forward against the worn leather seat. Through the grimy window, she could see nothing but endless prairie stretching toward jagged mountains that seemed to scrape the belly of storm clouds gathering overhead. This wasn't supposed to be her stop. Her gloved fingers clutched the wrinkled letter that had brought her halfway across the country from Philadelphia to this godforsaken corner of Wyoming territory. The ink had smudged during the 3-week journey, but she could still make out the words that had sealed her fate. Marriage arrangement confirmed. Arrival expected October 15th, 1873. The stagecoach driver's weathered face appeared at the window, tobacco juice staining his gray beard. He spat into the dirt before speaking. "End of the line, miss." Hawks Ridge. Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs. This ramshackle collection of wooden buildings scattered across the windswept plain looked nothing like the thriving cattle town described in the correspondence. She counted maybe 15 structures total, most appearing ready to collapse at the next strong gust. "Are you certain this is correct?" Her voice carried the refined accent of Philadelphia's main line, sounding absurdly out of place in this wilderness. The letter specified Hawks Ridge, but surely there must be another town by that name. The driver hauled her trunk down with unnecessary force, raising a cloud of dust. "Only one Hawks Ridge in these parts, lady. That'll be the final payment." She handed over the last of her travel money, watching her safety net disappear into his calloused palm. The stagecoach wheels were already turning before she realized she stood completely alone on the edge of nowhere, surrounded by her meager possessions and crushing uncertainty. The October wind cut through her traveling dress like a blade, carrying the scent of approaching snow and something else she couldn't identify, something wild and dangerous that made the hair on her neck stand upright. She pulled her wool cloak tighter and surveyed the town again, searching for any sign of the man who was supposed to become her husband. According to the arrangement made by her late father's business associate, she was to marry one Fletcher Hawthorne, a successful rancher seeking a refined wife to help raise his young daughter. The letters had painted him as a gentleman of means, educated and kind, desperate for feminine influence in his household after his wife's tragic death 2 years prior. But as Evangeline stood in the settling dust, watching chickens peck at manure in the middle of what passed for a main street, she began to suspect she'd been gravely misled about more than just the town's prosperity. A small figure emerged from behind the general store, moving with the hesitant gait of someone trying not to be noticed. The child couldn't have been more than 5 years old, with tangled brown hair escaping from beneath a boy's cap and clothes that hadn't seen soap in weeks. But something about the delicate bone structure and large, expressive eyes suggested this might be a girl masquerading as a boy for reasons Evangeline couldn't fathom. The child stopped 20 feet away, staring with undisguised curiosity. Evangeline offered what she hoped was a reassuring smile. "Hello there. I'm looking for Fletcher Hawthorne. Do you know where I might find him?" The child's eyes widened with something that looked like hope mixed with terror. She took a step closer, then seemed to think better of it and retreated again. "You're her," the child whispered, voice barely audible above the wind. "You're the lady who's supposed to marry Papa." Evangeline's breath caught. This wild little creature was her intended stepdaughter. The letters had described a well-mannered child in need of feminine guidance, not this feral waif who looked like she'd been living rough for months. "Yes, I believe I am." "You must be—" She realized she'd never been told the child's name. Fletcher's letters had referred only to "my daughter," without further identification. "Ruby," the girl said, edging closer with obvious longing. "Ruby Hawthorne, are you really going to stay? Really going to be my mama?" The naked desperation in those young eyes hit Evangeline like a physical blow. Whatever else was happening here, this child was starving for maternal affection. Her heart, already tender from her own recent losses, cracked open a little wider. I hope so, sweetheart. Where is your father? I was supposed to meet him today. Ruby's face crumpled. Papa's up at the north pasture. Won't be back till tomorrow. Maybe longer if the storm hits. But you can't leave. Please don't leave. The child launched herself forward, wrapping thin arms around Evangeline's waist with desperate strength. The impact nearly knocked her backward, but she steadied herself and returned the embrace, feeling how small and fragile Ruby was beneath the oversized clothes. I'm not going anywhere tonight, Evangeline assured her, though privately she wondered where exactly she could go even if she wanted to. But we should get you inside. This wind is getting worse. Ruby pulled back, looking up with eyes that held too much knowledge for such a young face. Mrs. Henley at the boarding house won't let me stay there anymore. Says I'm too much trouble. I've been sleeping in the barn behind Murphy's saloon. Evangeline's blood went cold. A 5-year-old girl sleeping alone in a barn? What kind of man was Fletcher Hawthorne that he'd allow his child to live like this? Well, that won't do at all. Show me to this boarding house. I'll speak with Mrs. Henley. Ruby shook her head vigorously. She don't like me, miss. Says I'm wild as an Indian and twice as dirty. She ain't wrong about the dirty part. Despite everything, Evangeline found herself smiling at the child's matter-of-fact assessment. Then we'll simply have to remedy that, won't we? A bath and a proper meal would do us both good. Hope flickered in Ruby's expression, quickly tamped down by hard-learned wariness. You sure you want to bother with me? Most folks don't. Evangeline knelt in the dust, bringing herself to Ruby's eye level despite the damage to her traveling dress. Ruby Hawthorne, I came here to become part of your family. That means you're my responsibility now, whether your father is present or not. And I always take care of what's mine. The child's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down dirt-stained cheeks. I tried to be good. I really tried. But everything I touch goes wrong, and Papa's so sad all the time, and I just make it worse. Evangeline pulled Ruby close again, her own eyes stinging with unexpected emotion. Oh, sweetheart, none of that is your fault. None of it. She had no idea what she was walking into. But one thing was crystal clear. This little girl needed someone to fight for her, and Evangeline had never backed down from a fight in her life. The boarding house proved to be a narrow, 2-story building that had seen better decades. Mrs. Henley answered Evangeline's knock with obvious reluctance, her sour expression souring further when she spotted Ruby peeking out from behind Evangeline's skirts. I told you, child, you're not welcome here. Go back to wherever you've been hiding. Mrs. Henley, Evangeline interrupted smoothly, drawing on every lesson in deportment her finishing school had provided. I'm Evangeline Pierce, Fletcher Hawthorne's intended bride. I require lodging for myself and his daughter. The older woman's demeanor shifted instantly, though her smile held no warmth. Well, why didn't you say so? Of course, of course. Though I'll warn you, that child is nothing but trouble. Wild as they come. Then it's fortunate I'm here to provide proper guidance. Evangeline's voice carried steel beneath the silk. We'll need your best room, with a bath drawn immediately. And we'll require dinner as well. Mrs. Henley's calculating gaze took in Evangeline's expensive traveling dress and well-made boots. That'll be $3 for the night, meals included. Payment in advance. Evangeline's heart sank. She had perhaps 50 cents remaining after paying the stagecoach driver. But Ruby was pressed against her side, small body trembling with cold and exhaustion, and there was no way she was letting this child spend another night in a barn. I'm afraid my funds are temporarily limited until my fiancé returns. However, I'm certain he'll settle any charges when he arrives tomorrow. Mrs. Henley's expression hardened. No payment, no room. That's my policy, bride or no bride. And I won't have that dirty child tracking mud through my establishment regardless. Ruby shrank back, clearly expecting rejection. The defeated slump of her small shoulders made something fierce and protective rise in Evangeline's chest. I understand your position, she said calmly. Perhaps we can come to an alternative arrangement." She began working the modest pearl ring from her finger, the last gift her father had given her before his death 6 months earlier. The pearl was small but flawless, set in quality gold that would fetch enough to cover their expenses. "This should more than cover our accommodation." Mrs. Henley snatched the ring before Evangeline could reconsider, examining it with practiced eyes. "I suppose this will do. But any damage caused by that child comes out of the excess." Within the hour, Evangeline found herself in a cramped but clean room, watching Ruby sink into a copper tub filled with steaming water. The child's wonder at such simple luxury broke Evangeline's heart all over again. "When did you last have a proper bath?" she asked gently, working soap through Ruby's tangled hair. "Don't remember," Ruby admitted, relaxing for the first time since Evangeline had met her. "Papa used to help me wash, but he's been so busy lately. And sad. Always so sad. Tell me about your mother." Ruby's face clouded. "She got sick when I was little. Coughed blood and couldn't get better. Papa tried everything, even brought a doctor from Cheyenne, but nothing helped. She died right when the snow melted 2 springs ago. 2 years. This child had been essentially motherless for 2 years, with a father too consumed by grief to properly care for her. Evangeline felt a surge of anger at Fletcher Hawthorne, followed immediately by sympathy. She knew what loss could do to a person, how it could steal the ability to function normally. "And since then, you've been taking care of yourself?" Ruby nodded, suddenly looking much younger than her 5 years. "I try not to bother Papa. He works so hard, and he gets that look on his face when I make noise or mess things up. Like it hurts him to see me." Evangeline's hand stilled in Ruby's hair. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm sure your father loves you very much. Sometimes grown-ups don't know how to show it when they're hurting. Do you think he'll like you?" Ruby asked suddenly, turning to look up at Evangeline with naked hope. "Do you think you'll want to stay?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the uncertainty and desperation of their situation. Evangeline had no idea what kind of man Fletcher Hawthorne truly was, or whether this arrangement would prove to be the salvation she'd hoped for, or simply another disaster in a year already full of them. But looking into Ruby's trusting eyes, she realized her own desires had become secondary. This child needed stability, needed someone to fight for her happiness and well-being. Whatever happened with Fletcher, Evangeline couldn't abandon Ruby now. "I think," she said carefully, "that we're going to figure this out together. Whatever happens, you're not going to face it alone anymore." Ruby's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, transforming her entire face. For the first time, Evangeline caught a glimpse of the beautiful, spirited child hidden beneath the neglect and sorrow. Later that evening, after a simple dinner of beef stew and cornbread, they sat together on the narrow bed while Evangeline brushed Ruby's clean, damp hair. The storm that had been threatening all day finally arrived, sending rain against the windows and wind howling around the building's corners. "Miss Evangeline?" Ruby's voice was drowsy, exhaustion finally claiming her. "Yes, sweetheart? Will you sing to me? Mama used to sing, but I can't remember the songs anymore." Evangeline's throat tightened. She began a gentle lullaby her own mother had sung, her voice soft and low in the lamplight. Ruby curled against her side like a kitten seeking warmth, and within minutes her breathing had deepened into sleep. But Evangeline lay awake long into the night, listening to the storm and wondering what the morning would bring. She'd traveled across the country expecting to marry a stranger and build a new life from the ashes of her old one. Instead, she'd found a child who desperately needed her, and a situation far more complicated than any letter could have conveyed. Tomorrow she would meet Fletcher Hawthorne and learn whether her leap of faith had been justified or foolish. But regardless of what happened between them, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Ruby Hawthorne had already claimed a piece of her heart, and Evangeline would move heaven and earth before she let anyone hurt this child again. The wind continued to howl outside, as if the very elements were trying to warn her about what lay ahead. But Evangeline had faced down creditors, social disgrace, and the loss of everything she'd ever known. Whatever Fletcher Hawthorne brought to this equation, she would handle it. She had to. Ruby was depending on her now, and Evangeline Pierce had never failed anyone who truly needed her. The storm raged on, but inside their small room, a woman and child slept peacefully together, already becoming the family neither had dared hope to find. Dawn broke gray and cold over Hawks Ridge, the storm having passed but leaving behind a bitter wind that cut through even the thickest wool. Evangeline woke to find Ruby pressed against her side, small fingers clutched in the fabric of her nightgown as if afraid she might disappear. The child stirred as Evangeline gently extracted herself from the desperate grip. Ruby's eyes flew open immediately, scanning the room with the wariness of someone accustomed to waking up in uncertain circumstances. "You're still here," Ruby whispered, wonder clear in her voice. "Of course I'm still here. I told you I wouldn't leave." Evangeline smoothed the tangles from Ruby's hair with gentle fingers. "Now let's get you dressed properly. I have a feeling today will bring answers to many of our questions." She had spent the early morning hours altering one of her own petticoats to create undergarments for Ruby and fashioning a makeshift dress from a spare shawl. It wasn't perfect, but it was clean and properly fitted, transforming the wild waif into something approaching a respectable young lady. Ruby stared at herself in the cracked mirror above the washstand, touching the soft fabric with reverent fingers. "I look like a real girl again." "You always were a real girl, sweetheart. You just needed someone to help you remember." "Downstairs, Mrs." Henley served them a breakfast of flapjacks and bacon, her manner considerably warmer now that payment had been secured. But Evangeline noticed how the woman's eyes followed Ruby with barely concealed distaste, as if the child were something unclean that might contaminate her establishment. "Your intended should be returning today, assuming the storm didn't delay him further," Mrs. Henley commented, refilling Evangeline's coffee cup. "Though I'll warn you, Fletcher Hawthorne hasn't been the same man since his Catherine died. Some say grief broke something in him that never healed proper." "What do you mean?" Evangeline kept her voice carefully neutral, but alarm bells were ringing in her mind. "Oh, he's not dangerous or nothing like that. Just ... distant. Spends all his time working the ranch, hardly speaks to anyone in town. That poor child has been running wild for the better part of 2 years while he buries himself in cattle and fence mending." Ruby had gone very still beside her, fork halfway to her mouth. Evangeline reached over and squeezed the child's hand reassuringly. "I'm sure he's simply been doing his best under difficult circumstances. Loss affects everyone differently." Mrs. Henley snorted. "Maybe so. But a child needs more than just a roof over her head and food on the table. Ruby there has been in and out of trouble more times than I can count, getting into fights with the other children, stealing food from the general store, sleeping rough when she should be home in her own bed. Perhaps if someone had shown her proper care and guidance instead of treating her like a nuisance, those problems wouldn't have developed," Evangeline said coolly. The boarding house keeper's face flushed, but before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. 3 riders were making their way down the muddy Main Street, their horses steaming in the cold morning air. Ruby jumped up so quickly she nearly knocked over her chair. "Papa's back. That's him on the black horse." Evangeline's heart began to race as she studied the man leading the small group. Even from a distance and bundled in a heavy coat, Fletcher Hawthorne cut an impressive figure. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his life in the saddle. But there was something about the rigid set of his shoulders and the way he held himself apart from his companions that suggested Mrs. Henley's assessment might not have been entirely wrong. "I should go to him," Evangeline said, rising from the table. But Ruby caught her hand, small fingers gripping tight. "What if he doesn't like you? What if he sends you away?" The naked fear in Ruby's voice made Evangeline's decision for her. She knelt beside the child's chair, taking both small hands in her own. "Ruby, listen to me very carefully. No matter what happens between your father and me, I will not abandon you. Do you understand? If he doesn't want me here, I'll find another way to make sure you're cared for properly. You promise?" "I promise." Ruby threw her arms around Evangeline's neck, holding tight for a moment before pulling back with determined resolve. "Then let's go meet Papa together." They stepped out onto the boarding house's narrow porch just as Fletcher Hawthorne swung down from his saddle. Up close, Evangeline could see that he was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the lines of exhaustion and sorrow etched around his eyes. His clothes were well made but worn, practical rather than fashionable, and everything about him spoke of a man who had forgotten how to care about anything beyond the bare necessities of survival. He looked up at the sound of the door closing, and for a moment their eyes met across the muddy street. Evangeline felt a jolt of something she couldn't quite name, not attraction exactly, but recognition of a kindred spirit who had also known profound loss. Then his gaze shifted to Ruby, and his entire expression changed. The carefully controlled mask slipped, revealing a depth of pain and guilt that made Evangeline's chest tighten with sympathy. "Ruby," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "I told you to stay at the Murphys until I got back." "The Murphys don't want me anymore," Ruby said matter-of-factly. "Neither do the Andersons or the Kellys. But it's okay, Papa. Miss Evangeline took care of me." Fletcher's attention returned to Evangeline with sharp focus, and she was suddenly very aware of how she must look, a city woman in expensive clothes, holding the hand of the daughter he'd clearly been struggling to manage on his own. "Miss Pierce, I presume." He touched his hat brim in a gesture that was polite but distant. "I apologize for not being here to meet you yesterday. We had cattle scattered by the storm." "Mr. Hawthorne." She inclined her head gracefully, drawing on every lesson in social diplomacy she'd ever learned. "I understand completely. These things cannot be helped." An awkward silence stretched between them while Ruby looked back and forth, clearly sensing the tension. Fletcher's companions had finished tending their horses and were watching the scene with barely concealed curiosity. "Perhaps we could speak privately," Fletcher said finally. "There are matters we need to discuss." "Of course." Evangeline squeezed Ruby's hand. "Sweetheart, why don't you help Mrs. Henley clear the breakfast dishes while your father and I talk?" Ruby's face fell, but she nodded obediently. "You won't leave without saying goodbye?" "I won't leave without saying goodbye," Evangeline promised, though she wondered if that promise might prove harder to keep than she'd hoped. Fletcher led her to a small parlor behind the boarding house's main room, closing the door behind them. In the confined space, he seemed even larger and more intimidating, but Evangeline had not survived the past year by backing down from difficult conversations. "I'll be direct, Miss Pierce, because I believe honesty serves everyone better than pretty lies." He stood with his back to the window, hands clasped behind him like a soldier at attention. "The arrangement your father's associate proposed may have been made in good faith, but circumstances have changed significantly since our correspondence began." Evangeline's heart sank, but she kept her expression composed. "What sort of circumstances?" "The ranch has been struggling. We lost nearly half our herd to rustlers last spring, and the bank is threatening foreclosure. I'm in no position to support a wife, particularly one accustomed to the refinements of city life." "I see." She studied his face, looking for tells beyond the obvious exhaustion and defeat. "And what of Ruby? What are your plans for her care?" Something flickered in his eyes, pain, guilt, and something else she couldn't identify. "Ruby is my responsibility. I'll find a way to manage." "By letting her sleep in barns and scavenge for food? By allowing her to run wild while you lose yourself in work?" Fletcher's jaw tightened. "You've been here less than a day, Miss Pierce. I don't think you're qualified to judge my parenting." "You're absolutely right. I've been here less than a day, and in that short time I've bathed a child who couldn't remember her last proper wash." fed a little girl who was clearly half-starved, and held her while she cried herself to sleep from loneliness. Evangeline's voice remained level, but steel ran beneath the silk. So now, I'm not qualified to judge your parenting. I'm simply qualified to recognize a child in desperate need of care. Fletcher turned away, staring out the window at the bleak landscape beyond. You don't understand the situation here. This isn't Philadelphia society. This is survival, pure and simple. Ruby is alive and fed and sheltered. That's more than many children in this territory can claim. Is that truly enough for you? Is bare survival all you want for your daughter? It's all I can provide right now. His voice was barely above a whisper, heavy with defeat. Catherine was the one who made this place a home. She was the one who knew how to raise a little girl properly. I'm just a rancher, Miss Pierce. I know cattle and horses and how to fix a broken fence. I don't know how to braid hair or sew dresses or sing lullabies. The raw honesty in his admission made Evangeline's anger shift towards something more complex. This wasn't a man who didn't love his daughter. This was a man drowning in grief and overwhelmed by responsibilities he felt unequipped to handle. Then perhaps, she said gently, we can help each other. Fletcher turned back to face her, wariness clear in his expression. What do you mean? I mean that I didn't come here expecting a fairy tale romance. Mr. Hawthorne, I came here because my father's debts left me with very few options, and marriage seemed preferable to destitution. But what I found was a little girl who desperately needs someone to fight for her happiness. She moved closer, close enough to see the silver threading through his dark hair and the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. You need help with Ruby. I need security and a home. Perhaps we can make an arrangement that serves us both, without pretending it's anything more than a practical solution to practical problems. Fletcher studied her face for a long moment, and Evangeline had the unsettling feeling he could see straight through to her soul. What exactly are you proposing? A marriage of convenience. I'll care for Ruby and manage your household. You'll provide shelter and support. We'll be partners in ensuring that child has the stability she needs to thrive. And what happens when you realize how harsh life can be out here? When you miss the comforts and society of city life? What happens to Ruby when you decide you've made a mistake? The question hit closer to home than Evangeline cared to admit. She had no idea whether she could truly adapt to frontier life, whether she was strong enough for the challenges ahead. But she thought of Ruby's desperate embrace, the child's whispered plea not to leave, and her resolve crystallized. Mr. Hawthorne, 6 months ago I lost my father, our home, and everything I thought was secure in my world. I learned that life can change in an instant, that nothing is guaranteed, and that sometimes survival requires making choices you never thought you'd have to make. She met his gaze directly. I also learned that I'm stronger than I ever imagined. Strong enough to adapt, strong enough to fight for what matters, and strong enough to keep my promises. And you're promising what, exactly? I'm promising that if you'll have me, I'll dedicate myself to giving Ruby the childhood she deserves. I'll stay, Mr. Hawthorne. Whatever comes, I'll stay and make this work. Fletcher was quiet for so long that Evangeline began to worry she'd overplayed her hand. Then he moved to the window again, staring out at something she couldn't see. The ranch is 12 miles from town. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. In winter, we can be snowed in for weeks at a time. The work is hard, the isolation is complete, and there are dangers you can't imagine, everything from wolves and bears to rustlers and renegade Indian bands. I understand. Do you? Do you really understand what you'd be giving up? Because once you're out there with us, there's no changing your mind when things get difficult. Ruby's already lost too much. I won't have her heart broken again by someone who makes promises they can't keep. The fierce protectiveness in his voice told Evangeline more about Fletcher Hawthorne's character than hours of conversation could have. Whatever his failings as a father, he loved Ruby deeply. That love, buried under grief and desperation, gave her hope that they might find a way to make this work. "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Hawthorne. The question is whether you're willing to accept help when it's offered." He turned back to her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something other than exhaustion in his expression. Hope, perhaps, or at least the possibility of hope. "There would be conditions," he said slowly. "Name them." "This would be a practical arrangement, nothing more. I'm not looking for romance or emotional complications. I loved my wife, Miss Pierce. That part of me died with her." Evangeline nodded, ignoring the small pang of disappointment his words caused. "I understand completely. And Ruby comes first in all decisions. Her welfare, her happiness, her future, that takes priority over everything else." "Naturally." "The ceremony would be simple, performed by the circuit judge when he comes through next month. Until then, you'd stay in town, maintain proprieties." "Of course." Fletcher extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Evangeline took it. His grip was firm and calloused, the hands of a man who worked for his living. "Then I suppose we have an agreement, Miss Pierce." "I suppose we do, Mr. Hawthorne." But even as they shook hands, sealing the bargain that would change all their lives, Evangeline couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something far more complex than a simple marriage of convenience. The way Fletcher's fingers lingered on hers just a moment too long, the flash of something vulnerable in his eyes before he looked away, these were not the reactions of a man whose heart had truly died with his wife. And that, she realized, might make their practical arrangement far more complicated than either of them was prepared to admit. 3 weeks later, Evangeline stood in the same cramped parlor wearing her mother's ivory silk wedding dress, hastily altered to fit her smaller frame. The circuit judge had arrived that morning, a grizzled man named Cornelius Webb, who performed marriages with the same efficiency he used for settling land disputes and minor criminal cases. Ruby sat in the front row of mismatched chairs Mrs. Henley had arranged for the ceremony, wearing a new blue dress Evangeline had sewn from fabric purchased with the last of her jewelry. The child's face glowed with happiness that had been building for weeks as she helped prepare for the wedding, chattering constantly about having a real mother again. Fletcher stood beside Evangeline in his best suit, freshly shaved and looking more handsome than she cared to admit. But his posture remained rigid, his responses to the judge's questions clipped and businesslike. This was a transaction to him, nothing more, and he seemed determined that everyone present understood that fact. The words were spoken, the simple gold band Fletcher had purchased slipped onto her finger, and suddenly Evangeline Pierce had become Evangeline Hawthorne. As they signed the marriage certificate, she caught Fletcher's eye and saw something flicker there. Not regret exactly, but a wariness that suggested he was questioning his decision. Ruby bounded up to them before either could speak, throwing her arms around both their waists simultaneously. "Now we're a real family. Now everything will be perfect." Over the child's head, Fletcher and Evangeline exchanged a look of mutual understanding. Nothing about their situation was perfect, but they would do whatever it took to protect Ruby's innocent joy. The ride to the Hawthorne Ranch took most of the afternoon, their wagon loaded with Evangeline's few remaining possessions and supplies from town. Ruby chattered excitedly about showing Evangeline her room, the barn cats, and her favorite hiding spots, while Fletcher drove in contemplative silence. As they crested a low hill, the ranch spread out before them, and Evangeline felt her heart sink. The main house was larger than she'd expected, but clearly showed signs of neglect, peeling paint, a sagging porch rail, shutters hanging askew. The barn and outbuildings were in better repair, suggesting Fletcher had prioritized the animals over human comfort. But it was the isolation that truly struck her. In every direction, empty prairie stretched to the horizon, broken only by distant mountains and the winding line of cottonwoods that marked a creek bed. There were no neighbors visible, no signs of civilization except the narrow trail they'd followed from town. Fletcher seemed to sense her thoughts. "Still sure about this, Mrs. Hawthorne?" The formal use of her new name made something flutter in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "Quite sure, Mr. Hawthorne." Ruby scrambled down from the wagon before it had fully stopped, racing toward the house with boundless energy. "Come see my room. Come see everything." The interior of the house told the same story as the exterior, once well-maintained and comfortable, now showing the effects of 2 years without feminine attention. Dust covered most surfaces, curtains hung limp and faded, and the kitchen showed signs of meals hastily prepared and consumed without thought for ambience or comfort. But the bones of the house were good, Evangeline realized as Ruby dragged her from room to room. High ceilings, well-proportioned spaces, and large windows that would let in abundant light once the grime was cleaned away. With work and attention, this could be a true home again. Fletcher appeared in the kitchen doorway as she was examining the cast-iron stove. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right. Ruby's is next to it. I'll sleep in the study downstairs." The careful distance in his voice reminded her that despite the wedding ceremony, theirs was still very much a business arrangement that's very considerate and practical. An awkward silence stretched between them until Ruby's voice called from somewhere upstairs. "Miss Evangeline, the ceiling in my room is leaking." Fletcher ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly exhausted. "I'll add it to the list. Between the roof repairs, fence mending, and getting ready for winter, I'm running out of hours in the day. Perhaps I can help with some of those tasks. I may be a city woman, but I'm not afraid of hard work." He studied her face with the same intensity he'd shown during their first conversation. "You might be surprised how hard frontier life really is. And you might be surprised how adaptable I can be when necessary." That evening, after a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Evangeline tucked Ruby into bed in her small but cozy room. The child's happiness was infectious, her excitement about having a mother again filling the house with an energy it had clearly lacked for years. "Will you sing to me again?" Ruby asked, snuggling deeper under the quilts Fletcher's late wife had made. As Evangeline's soft voice filled the room with a gentle lullaby, she was unaware that Fletcher stood in the hallway outside, listening. When she emerged from Ruby's room, she found him there, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "She hasn't been this happy since ... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Since her mother died. Yes." His voice was barely above a whisper. I'd forgotten what her laugh sounded like when she was truly content. They stood there in the narrow hallway, close enough that Evangeline could smell the soap he'd used for shaving and see the way the lamplight caught the silver in his hair. For a moment, the careful distance between them seemed to waver. Then Fletcher stepped back, clearing his throat. "I'll be up before dawn to check the cattle. There's coffee on the stove and bread in the pantry. Ruby usually wakes around 7. I'll take care of her. That's what I'm here for." "Yes," he said quietly. "That's what you're here for." But as he disappeared into the study that would serve as his bedroom, Evangeline couldn't shake the feeling that the lines they'd drawn around their arrangement were already beginning to blur. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised Evangeline with its domesticity. She threw herself into making the house a home again, scrubbing away years of neglect and creating spaces that felt warm and welcoming. Ruby proved to be an eager helper, delighting in tasks like dusting furniture and sorting through her mother's preserved linens. Fletcher left each morning before sunrise and returned each evening exhausted, but Evangeline began to notice small changes in him. He lingered longer at the dinner table, listening to Ruby's chatter about her day. He smiled more readily when the child showed him some improvement in her reading or a flower she'd picked for the kitchen table. And sometimes Evangeline caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Not romantic interest exactly, but something warmer than the careful politeness he'd maintained since their wedding day. Winter arrived early that year, with the first snow falling in late October. Evangeline had thought she understood what Fletcher meant about isolation, but being truly snowed in for days at a time tested her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. The work was relentless, feeding livestock, hauling water that had to be heated over the fire, maintaining warmth in a house that seemed determined to let in every draft. Her hands, once soft and smooth, became rough and calloused. Her back ached from lifting and carrying, and there were nights she fell into bed so exhausted she could barely remove her boots. But there were compensations, too. Ruby bloomed under consistent care and attention, growing from the wild waif Evangeline had first met into a bright, confident child. And slowly, gradually, Fletcher began to emerge from the shell of grief that had encased him for 2 years. It started with small things, a comment about something Ruby had said, a shared moment of amusement over one of her more creative interpretations of her lessons. Then longer conversations over evening coffee, discussions about ranch management and plans for the spring. Evangeline found herself looking forward to those quiet evening hours when Ruby was asleep and she and Fletcher could talk without the careful formality that still marked their daytime interactions. He was an intelligent man, she discovered, well-read despite his frontier circumstances, with opinions on everything from cattle breeding to territorial politics. And he was far more wounded than she'd initially realized. Catherine's death hadn't just broken his heart. It had shattered his confidence in his ability to care for the people who depended on him. The guilt he carried over Ruby's neglect was eating him alive, though he'd never admit it directly. December brought a blizzard that lasted 3 days, trapping them completely inside the house. By the second day, even Ruby's boundless energy had been exhausted, and all 3 of them were suffering from cabin fever. It was Fletcher who suggested they rearrange the furniture in the main room and play indoor games. Evangeline watched in amazement as he got down on his hands and knees to play horsey with Ruby, his deep laughter mixing with her delighted squeals. Later, after Ruby had finally worn herself out and fallen asleep on the sofa, Fletcher and Evangeline sat by the fire sharing a bottle of whiskey he'd produced from somewhere in the depths of his study. "You're good with her," Evangeline said, watching him adjust the blanket around his sleeping daughter. "Better than you think you are." Fletcher stared into the flames, the whiskey having loosened his usual reserve. "Catherine always said I was too serious with Ruby, that I didn't know how to just play, just be silly with her. After Catherine died, it got worse. Everything I did felt like I was failing her memory. Grief makes us hard on ourselves. We punish ourselves for surviving when they couldn't." He looked at her sharply. "You speak from experience. My mother died when I was 15. I spent years convinced that if I'd been a better daughter, if I'd noticed she was sick sooner, if I'd insisted on a different doctor." Evangeline shrugged. "Grief lies to us, Mr. Hawthorne. It tells us we're responsible for things beyond our control." "Fletcher," he said quietly. "When it's just us, call me Fletcher." The use of his given name felt intimate in a way their marriage ceremony hadn't, a crossing of boundaries that had nothing to do with legal contracts and everything to do with genuine connection. "Fletcher," she repeated, tasting the name. "And you should call me Evangeline." Evangeline. The way he said it, soft and wondering, made her pulse quicken in a way she wasn't prepared for. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and Ruby's soft breathing. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, but inside their small circle of warmth and light, everything felt peaceful and right. "I owe you an apology," Fletcher said suddenly. "For what?" "For assuming you couldn't handle this life. For thinking you'd run back to civilization at the first sign of hardship." He turned to face her fully. "You've exceeded every expectation I had. I told you I was stronger than I looked." "You did. I should have listened." He reached out tentatively, as if to touch her hand, then seemed to think better of it and pulled back. "Ruby loves you, completely and without reservation. You've given her something I couldn't, the security of knowing she's truly wanted. She's easy to love. She's bright and funny and resilient in ways that amaze me every day. She gets that from her mother. Catherine was—" He paused, struggling with something. Catherine was everything good and gentle in the world. When I lost her, I thought I'd lost the capacity for happiness entirely. Evangeline felt a familiar pang at the reverence in his voice when he spoke of his first wife. It was foolish to be jealous of a dead woman, but she couldn't deny the emotion. "You haven't lost that capacity," she said gently. "I've seen you happy, Fletcher. With Ruby, when you forget to guard yourself. Happiness is still there. You've just been afraid to claim it. Have I?" His voice was very quiet, and when she looked at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and the weight of everything they'd been careful not to acknowledge. Then Ruby stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about snowmen, and the spell was broken. Fletcher stood abruptly, suddenly all business again. "I should check on the livestock one more time before bed. Make sure the barn doors are secure." He was gone before Evangeline could respond, leaving her alone with her racing heart and the uncomfortable realization that their practical arrangement had become something far more complicated. Christmas came quietly, marked by simple gifts and Ruby's uninhibited joy at having a complete family for the holiday. Evangeline had sewn new dresses for both herself and Ruby, while Fletcher surprised them with a rocking horse he'd carved in secret during his evening hours in the barn. Ruby's delight was infectious, but it was Fletcher's shy pleasure in their happiness that made Evangeline's throat tight with emotion. This was what a family could be, she thought, not perfect, but complete in all the ways that mattered. January brought tragedy in the form of a severe fever that struck Ruby without warning. For 3 terrifying days, she burned with fever while Evangeline and Fletcher took turns sitting by her bedside, applying cool cloths and trying to force small sips of water between her cracked lips. Fletcher blamed himself with characteristic intensity, convinced that something he'd done or failed to do had caused Ruby's illness. Evangeline watched him pace the house like a caged animal, his face haggard with sleeplessness and terror. On the 3rd night, when Ruby's fever finally broke and she fell into natural sleep for the first time in days, Fletcher collapsed into the chair beside her bed and wept like a broken man. Evangeline found him there an hour later, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with exhaustion and relief. Without hesitation, she went to him, placing her hands on his shoulders and offering what comfort she could. "She's going to be fine," she murmured. "The fever broke cleanly. She's going to be fine." Fletcher looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes, and without warning, pulled her into his arms. She went willingly, holding him while he fought to regain control of emotions too long suppressed. "I can't lose her too," he whispered against her hair. "I can't survive losing her too." "You won't. We won't. She's strong, Fletcher. She's going to be fine." They held each other in the lamplight while Ruby slept peacefully beside them, and Evangeline knew with sudden, startling clarity that she was in love with her husband. Not the careful affection of a practical arrangement, but deep, consuming love that had grown gradually over months of shared domesticity and mutual care. The realization should have terrified her. Fletcher had been clear from the beginning that his heart was buried with Catherine, that this marriage was purely practical. But holding him in her arms, feeling the way he clung to her strength in his moment of vulnerability, she couldn't bring herself to regret the emotion. Ruby recovered quickly, as children do, bouncing back to full energy within days. But the crisis had changed something fundamental between Fletcher and Evangeline. The careful distance they'd maintained became harder to preserve when they'd shared such intimate fear and relief. February brought the first real test of their new understanding when a group of cattle rustlers struck the ranch, making off with nearly 50 head of prime breeding stock. Fletcher tracked them for 2 days through bitter cold, returning home empty-handed and furious with his own failure. "We can't afford losses like this," he told Evangeline grimly as she tended the rope burns on his hands. "The banknote comes due in June. Without those cattle ... double quotes he didn't need to finish." They both understood what foreclosure would mean, not just the loss of the ranch, but the loss of their home, their security, everything they'd built together. What can we do? Evangeline asked quietly. I don't know. Work harder. Pray for good calving season. Hope the rustlers don't come back. Fletcher's laugh was bitter. Not much of a plan. But Evangeline was already thinking, her mind racing through possibilities. What if we could recover the stolen cattle? The trail's too cold now. And even if it wasn't, tracking rustlers into the Badlands is a job for the territorial marshal, not a rancher with more debts than sense. Not tracking. Trading. Fletcher looked up sharply. What do you mean? I overheard Mrs. Henley talking to some of the other women in town. There's been talk about the rustlers, speculation about who they are, where they hole up. What if some of that talk is more than speculation? You're suggesting we negotiate with thieves? I'm suggesting we explore all our options before we lose everything we've worked for. Fletcher studied her face with the intensity she'd come to recognize when he was weighing difficult decisions. This isn't your fight, Evangeline. You could walk away tomorrow, start over somewhere else. You don't have to risk everything for a ranch that might fail anyway. The suggestion hit her like a physical blow. After all they'd shared, all they'd built together, he still thought she might abandon them? Is that what you want? She asked quietly. For me to leave? No. The word came out rougher than he'd intended. God help me, no. But I won't trap you in a failing enterprise just because we signed papers. Fletcher. She moved closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home now, my family. We'll find a way to make this work. Our marriage was supposed to be practical, convenient. It wasn't supposed to become... What? What wasn't it supposed to become? He reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing her cheek with devastating gentleness. It wasn't supposed to become something I couldn't bear to lose. Evangeline's heart stopped, then began beating double time. Fletcher ... double quotes. I know I said my heart died with Catherine. I believed that for 2 years. But these past months with you and Ruby... He shook his head as if trying to clear it. I don't know what this is between us, but I know I can't go back to the man I was before you came here. You don't have to go back. And you don't have to choose between loving Catherine's memory and allowing yourself to feel something new. Don't I? Doesn't loving you betray everything I shared with her? The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying in their implications. Fletcher had just admitted he loved her, and his expression suggested he was as shocked by the confession as she was. Love isn't finite, Fletcher. The heart doesn't have a limited capacity. Loving me doesn't diminish what you felt for Catherine any more than loving Ruby diminishes what you feel for me. He stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Then, with infinite care, he cupped her face in his calloused hands. When did you become so wise? When I fell in love with the stubborn rancher who thought his heart was made of stone. Fletcher's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. I love you, Evangeline Hawthorne. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you make Ruby laugh. I love how you've turned this house back into a home. And I love you, Fletcher Hawthorne. Your gentleness with Ruby, your dedication to this land, the way you've learned to trust again despite everything you've lost. When he kissed her, it was with the reverence of a man who'd never expected to feel such emotion again. Evangeline melted into his embrace, tasting tears on both their faces and not caring whose they were. They were interrupted by Ruby's voice calling from upstairs, asking for water and complaining that her throat was scratchy. But as they separated, both breathless and slightly stunned by what had just occurred between them, Evangeline saw her future stretching ahead with crystalline clarity. This was where she belonged, in this house, with this man, raising this extraordinary child who'd first captured her heart in a dusty street 3 months ago. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And tomorrow, she would begin her campaign to save their ranch, because Evangeline Hawthorne had never lost a fight that truly mattered, and she wasn't about to start now. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it new hope and the urgent business of calving season. The stolen cattle were never recovered, But Fletcher's careful breeding program had produced a strong crop of healthy calves that would help offset their losses. More importantly, Evangeline's patient networking in town had yielded unexpected results. Mrs. Henley, it turned out, had a nephew who'd been running with questionable companions, and a carefully orchestrated conversation had led to information about where the rustlers were likely to strike next. The territorial marshal, armed with this intelligence, managed to break up the gang and recover cattle from several ranches. While the Hawthorns didn't get their original stock back, the compensation from recovered animals sold at auction was enough to satisfy the bank and buy them breathing room. But the real victory was smaller and more personal. One evening in late April, as Evangeline sat on the porch watching Fletcher teach Ruby to whistle, she felt a small hand slip into hers. "I'm glad you stayed," Ruby said simply. "I'm glad you became my mama for real." Evangeline squeezed the small fingers, her heart full to overflowing. "I'm glad too, sweetheart. This is exactly where I belong." Fletcher looked up from his whistling lesson, catching her eye across the yard. His smile was soft and warm and completely without reservation, the expression of a man who'd finally learned to trust in happiness again. As the sun set over their little ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Evangeline reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. She'd been sent to marry a stranger and found a family instead. She'd expected mere survival and discovered a love deeper than anything she'd ever imagined possible. The stagecoach driver had been wrong that day 3 months ago. This hadn't been the wrong destination at all. This was exactly where she was meant to be.